In this second mini lecture, we'll talk about reasons why you would graft. After all, it's a very complicated and expensive way to asexually propagate plants, so why would you use this when you can just take cuttings? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and we're going to go through each of these in some detail, starting with the first bullet point here. Sometimes cutting propagation is impractical. There are some plants that simply don't root from cuttings very well. A good example is the plant pictured here. This is Shimawalickii. It's an ornamental tree native to China, and this plant just does not propagate well from cuttings. I did my master's research on developing a propagation protocol for this plant, and we tried softwood cuttings, semi-hardwood cuttings, hardwood cuttings. We tried different concentrations of rooting hormone, and the best percentage of rooting I could ever get out of my Shimawalickii cuttings was 43%, which is not good at all. That's certainly not good enough for commercial production a lot of the time. So this would be a good candidate for grafting, and in fact, one of my committee members started a project on grafting these plants after I graduated. Fruit and nut trees are another good example of plants that are typically grafted commercially because cutting propagation is just impractical. Apples are a good example of this. And for cuttings to be impractical for a plant, it may be that they just don't root very well, or maybe it takes a really long time and it's just much faster to graft. So that's one reason. The next reason that was on that large list was rootstock benefits. Rootstock plants are specifically selected to have good traits for roots. So these would be things like disease resistance to soil-borne pathogens, or drought resistance, flooding resistance, all traits that have to do with how the roots of the plant interact with the soil. A lot of times a nice, sturdy, resistant rootstock plant is chosen to serve as the rootstock for a much more delicate or susceptible plant that has very nice flowers or fruits. So by grafting that susceptible scion onto the more sturdy rootstock, you can have the benefits of the rootstock sturdiness combined with the ornamentalness or the fruit of the scion. There are also a few other characteristics that rootstocks can pass on. One of those is dwarfing. If you're trying to create a dwarf cultivar of a plant, a lot of times you can do that by grafting a regular plant onto a dwarf rootstock. And another one is precocity. Precocity is just early flowering or fruiting. Now this is surprising because you don't think about the rootstock affecting the flowering and fruiting of a grafted plant since it's at the base. But it does work. If you pick a rootstock plant that has early flowering or fruiting and graft a later flowering and fruiting scion on top, a lot of the times that will bring the flowering and fruiting time of that grafted plant earlier in the year. Now there are two types of rootstocks you can use, seedling or clonal, and this has to do with how you grow the rootstock plant before you graft it. Seedling rootstocks, as you might suspect from the name, are just grown from seed. It's a very easy and economical way to grow rootstocks because seeds are cheap and you just sow them. Viruses are not usually transmitted by seeds, so you don't have to worry about that. And sometimes, and this is only sometimes, you end up with a better root system on a seed-grown plant than a clonally propagated plant, but that's only sometimes. So you may be thinking, well, that all sounds great. Why would I even use a clonal rootstock? Well, a clonal rootstock is one that's been propagated asexually, usually by cuttings, although layering is also an option. You want to use a clonal rootstock when uniformity is really important. Let's say that the plant that you're using as your rootstock has really good disease resistance and drought tolerance, but it doesn't come very true from seed. If you plant it from seed, you get a really wide range of things in the offspring. Well, in that case, you would want to clonally propagate that rootstock so you can preserve that disease resistance and the drought resistance, and so in that case, you would need to use cuttings or layering. Now, the plants pictured here, these are clonally propagated rootstocks that were propagated by mound layering. You can see how close they all are together. They haven't been cut apart yet. And this is how apples are propagated. They use clonal rootstocks for apples usually, and since apples are so hard to root from cuttings, they mound layer them. Then those mound layered plants, the new layers that come off them are the rootstocks that will be used to graft onto. Remember, all grafted plants have a rootstock. Sometimes we also have that inner stock, which is the in-between piece, the piece grafted between the rootstock and the scion. There are some special benefits of inner stocks. One is it allows us to overcome a certain type of graft incompatibility. Let's say that our rootstock plant and our scion plant that we want to combine together because of their special characteristics, let's say they're incompatible with each other. We can't successfully form a graft union if we graft them together. But let's say that both the rootstock and the scion are compatible with a third plant. We'll call it plant C. Well, now if we take an inner stock of plant C and graft it in between the rootstock and scion, it serves as a compatibility bridge. So while grafting that rootstock and scion directly together wouldn't have worked, grafting them together with an inner stock in between that they're both compatible with would work. Just like any other part of a grafted plant, any favorable characteristics in the inner stock can be passed on to the grafted plant as a whole. So for example, dwarfing is a characteristic that can be in the rootstock, and if you just have a rootstock and scion, it can make the whole plant a dwarf. But let's say that you've got a nice disease-resistant rootstock and a nice fruiting scion, but neither of those have a dwarf trait. Well, if you put a dwarf-traded inner stock in between them, you can now have a plant that has all three of those things. And with dwarfing in particular, it's interesting because often the size of the inner stock determines how dwarfed the tree is. So if you use a really large inner stock, it will be very dwarfed. If you only use a small little piece of inner stock, it'll not be quite as dwarfed. Apples are our example here again. We want to grow dwarf apples because of course it's much easier to harvest the fruit off them. So that would be an example where an inner stock may come in handy. Again, when we use an inner stock in our grafting, that's called double working because basically you have two graft unions forming. Another type of grafting you can do that's very beneficial is top working. And top working basically allows you to change the scion cultivar by grafting onto established plantings or rootstocks. So a lot of the pictures I've shown you so far, they've gone and grafted down near the very base of the plant, and that's pretty typical. Usually when you do a graft, you just want to keep the roots of the rootstock in a small enough piece of stem above the ground to graft your scion onto. But for top working, we don't do this. We graft our scion onto the rootstock plant pretty far up in the plant. And so this is what they do again with apples, and it's pictured here. This is an apple. They come in and they top work two scions onto the branch of a rootstock. So they cut off that branch to have a nice flat surface, and then they graft on the two scions. They do two so that you have a better chance of success. If one of them dies, maybe the other one will live. But if they both take, what they do is they come in, as you see in the bottom picture there, and they remove one of them. Because if you let both of those grow all the way out, you wouldn't have a very good or stable branch structure for that tree. So that's top working. And so you could see how this would be a really important advantage for something like apple orchards. If you are growing an apple tree, let's say you're growing red delicious apples, which I can't remember if we've talked about this before, but I don't like red delicious apples. But let's say you were growing red delicious apples way back in the day. They were really popular. That's what you were growing. But now you want to switch. You don't want to grow red delicious anymore because there's a lot of better options. So now you want to switch and grow Honeycrisp apples. Well, instead of having to pull out all of your nice old apple trees and plant new ones, you can instead just top work them all. Apple trees take a while to get to a nice, large, mature size. They take 7 or 8 years just to produce apples if you grow them from seed. And to get them nice and large and producing lots of apples takes a long time, so we don't want to have to rip out all those nice old trees. So instead, we cut off all the branches of the Red Delicious, we top work on a bunch of scions of Pink Lady, and just like that, we've converted our whole orchard to a new cultivar. Another benefit here, you can grow multiple cultivars or even species on a single tree. Back to the apples. Apple cultivars are typically self-infertile. That means that they can't fertilize themselves, and so they need to cross-pollinate with a different cultivar in order for fruit to form. Well, again, here, instead of having to plant a bunch of different types of apple trees in your orchard, what you can do is come in on a couple of trees and just graft on one branch the cultivar that's going to be your pollinator. So you have your Honeycrisp apples growing, all those top works worked, but you have to cross your Honeycrisp with something else. There are actual rules about what crosses with what, but I don't know them, so we're just going to say Pink Lady. You need some Pink Lady apples to cross-pollinate with the Honeycrisps so we get actual apples. So instead of having to plant a whole Pink Lady tree or top work a whole Pink Lady tree, I can just come in on a few of my Honeycrisp trees, top work on a few Pink Ladies, and now cross-pollination will happen. Another way that this whole idea is used, the growing of multiple cultivars or species on a single tree, is, wait for it, the fruit salad tree, or the fruit cocktail tree, or the multi-budded fruit tree. You'll hear it called all of these things. You find these in plant mail order catalogs, and they act like they're some kind of magical tree. They're not. I mean, they are amazing, but they're not magical. What they've done is somebody has just come in and top worked, or in a lot of cases budded, 3 or 4 different cultivars or species onto the same tree. You can only do this with closely related species. So if you see these fruit salad trees for sale, it's either going to be one like this that grows peaches, nectarines, and plums all on the same tree, because peaches, nectarines, and plums are all in the same genus, the genus Prunus. Another example of this that you'll often see is a citrus fruit salad tree where they've got oranges, lemons, and grapefruits all growing on the same tree, and again, those are all in the same genus, so it works. You couldn't do like oranges and apples and peaches all on the same tree because they're not closely related enough. You could do an apple tree with different kinds of apples like Golden Delicious, Honeycrisp, and Pink Lady all on the same tree. So there's a lot of options for that, and the graft that you do for it, we'll talk about later, is called budding. It's not that hard, so this is something you could conceivably do and make on your own at home. The one thing you have to watch out for is sometimes one species or cultivar is a lot more vigorous than the other, and so you have to keep pruning it so that it doesn't take over. So for example, maybe the plums are a lot more vigorous growing than the peaches and nectarines. If you don't keep them pruned and in check, what you'll end up with is just a plum tree because it'll overtake all the resources and crowd out the peaches and nectarines. So it's not a low maintenance kind of tree. You have to prune it pretty regularly to maintain that balance of the different fruits on it. But if you're willing to do that, you can have something pretty cool in your yard. A few more reasons to graft. You can hasten the flowering and fruiting of seedlings. All right, remember I said apples, if you grow them from seed, can take 7 to 8 years before they even produce an apple. Well, if you take a seedling and graft a mature piece of apple, so a scion from a mature, already fruiting apple tree onto the seedling, a lot of times what can then occur is that you can get apples from that seedling after the graft union forms. So instead of having to wait 7 or 8 years, you graft it much earlier and you get apples much earlier. Same concept with flowers if that's what you're looking for. Another advantage of grafting is to obtain special forms of plant growth. So for example, look at the tree in the picture here. This is actually a Canadian hemlock, which is usually a very tall, large tree, but this one has been grafted to be both a dwarf form tree and what we call a weeping form, where the branches hang down like that. So most weeping trees have been grafted as well. So for example, weeping cherries have been grafted. So a weeping scion is grafted onto a non-weeping rootstock, and you get this special form of the plant. Weeping willows, incidentally, are not grafted. That's just how they grow. So hastening flowering and fruiting of seedlings, and also obtaining special forms of plant growth. Here's another example of obtaining special forms of plant growth. Remember back in the Freaks and Mutants lecture where we had the witch's broom garden guys, the guys in the Czech Republic who would go shoot down those witch's brooms from the trees. They would then propagate it to get miniature conifers like what you see on the left here. That's a tiny pine tree. Isn't it adorable? It is. So if you want to make a tiny pine tree like that, the way that they do it is they take scion wood off of the witch's broom and they graft it onto a regular pine. One of those grafts is shown in the picture here on the right, and so then They let that scion grow, they cut off the top of the rootstock, and now you have a little miniature conifer. So again, special forms of growth that you can obtain by grafting. And then finally, grafting can be used for repair processes. One type, inarching, is shown here. This is if you have root injuries. So let's say that the voles eat the roots of your plants. Voles are all in my yard right now, and we are at war. Alright, so let's say the voles have eaten all the roots off of your prized tree, and now you're worried because it might die. Let's say not all of the roots. Let's just say a lot of the roots. Well, what you can do is inarching, and the way you do it is you plant seedlings, about 1-year-old trees, in a circle all the way around the injured tree. Alright, and maybe a few feet away from it. Then you will graft those seedlings to the injured tree in something that we call an approach graft. So that's what you see in the picture on the top left there. They bend the seedling in and graft it to the trunk of the large tree, the injured tree. Once the graft union forms, the top of those seedlings is cut off, so all that remains is their root systems, but it has formed a successful graft union with the large injured tree. You're going to use several of them because, of course, your seedlings are a lot smaller with smaller root systems than the injured tree, and we need several of those to support it. But basically, this provides a better root system for that tree with the root injuries by inarching. And you can see a picture in the bottom there, the bottom right. On the left side of that picture, you see the seedlings as they begin to bend them to the injured tree and graft them. And then on the right side of that picture, you see many years later as they've grown together with the original tree, providing that better root system. It doesn't even have to be a tree with a root injury. It's often used to repair trees with a root injury, but let's say that your tree is old and you just really want to give it a boost, give it a better root system, you can use inarching for that too. But the key here is a type of repair grafting used for issues with the roots of the tree. Bridge grafting is another type of repair grafting, and this is for trunk injuries. So in this case, let's say we had a lot of snow, which we did this year, well, for North Carolina, and it mounted up around the tree trunk, and now the voles and the rabbits and stuff crawled up next to the trunk, and they gnawed the bark off and girdled it right there at the base. Well, that's a problem. That's going to kill our tree. So the way you can fix this with bridge grafting is you take scions of 1-year-old growth. These scions could come off the original tree from the tips of the branches. You cut them into pieces as shown in the picture here. You clean up the bark so that basically you stick your scion portion in such that it bridges the dead girdled area of the trunk. So it's going from the live tissue at the base of the injury to the live tissue above the injury. So you make that graft, and then you're going to do this not just one piece, but again with several pieces all the way around the trunk of the tree, and what you get as a result of that are scions that bridge the injured area to ensure better transport of water, nutrients, and sugars, and to keep it alive. So inarching repairs root injuries, bridge grafting repairs trunk injuries. Now there's one other pretty neat purpose or advantage of grafting that I'd like to share with you. Art. So these trees were grafted by a man named Axel Erlandson. He was born in the late 1800s and lived into the 1900s. He was from Sweden, and he taught himself how to graft. He got the idea by seeing plants graft naturally in the wild. This does happen sometimes. You've probably seen it. Sometimes if you have a multi-trunk tree, you'll see a place where the two trunks touch each other and eventually grow together, and that's pretty much just the tree grafting itself together in the wild. This happens. Sometimes it happens with branches that are next to each other. So he saw that and got the idea to try to use that to make art. So through a combination of grafting, training, and pruning, he created what he called the tree circus. It was sort of a tourist attraction. It is now at Gilroy Gardens in California. So he made some very cool stuff. It's worth looking into if you're interested in it. Look up this guy, Axel Erlandson. Very cool stuff. So here's some. This is one of the most famous ones that he did. He trained these trees and wove them together and then allowed them to sort of self-graft as they grew larger. And of course, it's a fuzzy picture, but his famous tree chair and his tree ladder.